This is our fourth lecture in our series on church history. We're covering church history in this entire series, going from the Apostolic Church all the way up to the time of the Reformation. And in this particular lecture, we're going to talk about the early church and persecution in the early church. Let's just get our bearings just a little bit to think about the time that we're talking about. I've divided up this section of church history up to the Reformation into four periods. First of all, the Apostolic Church, that's AD 33 to about 100. These are approximate dates. Then the early church period from approximately 100 to approximately 312. Then the Christian Empire early period, 312 to 1000. And then the Christian Empire, that later period, 1000 to 1500. That is just shortly before the Reformation. So we're going to focus on that early church period that is after the time of the apostles, yet before the Roman Empire began to Christianize in a radical way under Constantine. That gives us sort of a good historical marking point. And in this particular lecture, we're going to talk about persecution in the early church. So one thing we want to recognize if we're going to talk about this time of the early church is just to get a very quick geographical idea of what we're talking about. We're talking about basically Christianity within the Roman Empire. And in this early church period, Christianity spread throughout virtually all the Roman Empire. Of course, it was stronger some places and others. And it began to reach, in some places, in some forms, beyond the Roman Empire in some appreciable ways as well. But mainly, Christianity was spread throughout the entire mighty, impressive Roman Empire. Now, as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, it encountered something that it did encounter in some ways at the very beginning of Christianity, and that is persecution. Jesus told his followers that they should expect persecution. Let's remind ourselves just of a few of these verses. Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, Jesus said, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Again, very plainly, Jesus there in the Sermon on the Mount telling his disciples that they should expect to be persecuted. If you notice, he said, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." Jesus told his disciples to rejoice. This is to be expected. This is just part of what it means, at least in some regard, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. You also see in Matthew chapter 23, verse 34, Jesus said, "Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city." Jesus there is speaking to the religious leaders of his day, telling them he knows that they are going to persecute his followers. And then I'll give just a couple more references here. Luke chapter 21, verse 12, Jesus said, "But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake." By the way, that's a very interesting statement Jesus made. Jesus predicted that his followers would make such an impact upon the world that they would catch the attention of kings and rulers and be held to account, be persecuted by kings and rulers. Jesus understood, of course, that his followers, his disciples, and the gospel that they preached would spread broadly throughout the world, and it would be challenged and persecuted in many places. So much so that the Apostle Paul, as inspired by the Holy Spirit, agreed with the words of Jesus when he said, "Yes, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution." So again, we're not surprised, understanding these passages from the Bible, we're not surprised at the phenomenon of persecution. It happens. Jesus said it would. The New Testament said it would. So in one sense, the persecution that Christians faced in the early church period, again, we're talking approximately 100 to 312, that persecution was not unique. Christians have often been persecuted. However, there was something different about much of the persecution in the early church period, in that it was organized and it was sponsored by the state, by the government itself. Now, Christians can and will be persecuted by individuals and by mobs acting outside of the law. That's bad. And it's a true burden for Christians to suffer. I mean, you could even say that most persecution happens that way. A person is rejected from their family because they become a Christian. A person is fired from their job because they're a Christian. A person is prevented from pursuing certain educational opportunities because they are a Christian. And much of this can happen on a very individual and personal level. Now, that's bad. And as I said before, it's a genuine burden for Christians to suffer either in the ancient world or today. And in the early church period, Christians were often despised by individuals. Did you know that the earliest picture, it's really not a picture, it's just a drawing of a crucifixion, is some graffiti from the walls of Pompeii? It pictures a Christian kneeling before a donkey on a cross. The donkey's on the cross, and below it is written in mockery, Alexemnos worships his God. You can see the mockery there. This God that Alexemnos, Alex, we could just call him, worships, it's a donkey on a cross. No doubt that this was a slur against early Christians. But it wasn't necessarily from the government. It was just a mocking graffiti that somebody put upon a wall in Pompeii. Now, that's one small example of how Christians and their faith might be despised by individual people in the surrounding culture, in the ancient world, and of course, these things continue today. However, there is a significant difference between official and unofficial persecution. Every Christian who is a Christian should at some time or another face some kind of what we might call unofficial persecution. We find this throughout the book of Acts, where the apostles and others are harassed by the religious officials or sometimes by angry mobs, but they weren't persecuted, they weren't troubled or harassed by the officials of the Roman Empire, by the state, not in the book of Acts. Now, it is possible that state persecution of Christians began as early as the reign of Claudius. Claudius had his reign during the book of Acts, and he reigned from 41 to 54. And in general, Claudius was tolerant towards a variety of religions. Yet there are some lines from the Roman historian Suetonius that are intriguing. In writing about some events in Rome, somewhere around the year 52, this is what Suetonius wrote. Since the Jews were constantly making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, that is Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Now, it may be that this fellow Chrestus, mentioned by Suetonius, may have been just some individual with that name who was a thorn in the side of Roman politicians, and they were anxious to be rid of him and his followers. That's a possibility. But it's also possible that Chrestus may have been the way that ignorant government officials pronounced the name Christ or Christus, Christus. That's the name about perhaps which the Jews argued. Now, these kind of arguments between Jews and Christians were not unknown. We find examples of them in Acts chapter 19 in the city of Ephesus. Claudius possibly was the first emperor then to persecute Christians who were perceived as being a Jewish sect, and to persecute them for what he would call, or what Suetonius described, as disturbing the peace. Now, that's a possible early reference to persecution of Christians by the state, but we know for certain state-sponsored persecution was used against the church in a significant way during the reign of Nero. Nero reigned from 54 to 68, and Nero was a man who was very violent in his persecution of Christians. Matter of fact, we know from history that on July 19th in the year 64, a fire broke out in the working class section of Rome. For 7 days, the fire raged through the city, and it destroyed block after block of crowded housing in the city. Only 4 of the 14 quarters of the city escaped damage, and 10 of those were destroyed, the 10 remaining. Now, legend has it that Caesar Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Not really true. The instrument, the fiddle, wouldn't be invented for 1,000 years. Now, it is true, apparently, that Nero loved music, and some people do suggest that he sang or played the lyre. Nevertheless, there were many people in Nero's own day that thought that he himself had set the fire. Many modern historians believe that this was Nero's brutal attempt at what we might call urban renewal, because he took and built upon a lot of that burned area for himself. Now, whether Nero set the fires or not, he blamed the disaster on the Christians. And afterward, Nero promised that he was going to hunt down and kill Christians. So the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus wrote about 115 AD. He wrote about Nero's persecution of the Christians. Again, this happened between the years 54 and 68. So let me read to you a long section here from Tacitus. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Okay, so you see that during that little section here, Tacitus is describing how this Pontius Pilate inflicted the extreme penalty upon Christus, and this was done all as a part of tortures done upon these Christians. He's explaining where Christians came from with the connection with Christus and Pontius Pilate. But here now, in this next continuing paragraph, you're going to see how he describes more of the persecution. We read here, accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, and in Rome an immense multitude was convicted, not so much on the charge of arson as because of their hatred of the human race. Besides being put to death, they were made to serve as objects of amusement. They were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to pieces by dogs. Others were crucified, others set on fire to serve to illuminate the night when daylight failed. Now, you have to admit, these are horrific things that Tacitus describes. This rounding up of a huge number of Christians. And as he says, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much on the charge of arson, not because they burned the city of Rome, but he said, but because of their hatred of the human race. I'll deal with this a little bit more later on in this lecture. But one of the things that pagans or the Romans accused Christians of in this early church period was being haters of the human race. And many times it was simply because they wouldn't associate with other people in the same sinful enjoyments that they would go off to. Everybody's going off for a night of immorality at the temple of Jupiter. And the Christians would say, no, thank you. We're not going. Oh, what? Do you hate us? Sometimes a Christian faith might divide a family. Someone in the family becomes a Christian, and they're cast out by their family and saying, see, you don't love the human race because you've become a Christian. Obviously, this was a lie, but it was something that was said about Christians. And because of this perception, or because of this lie that Christians were haters of the human race, they were tortured and put to death in terrible, horrible ways. You saw Tacitus say that some of them were set on fire to serve to illuminate the night. They were made human torches and burned for the amusement of others. Tacitus himself, by the way, saw that Christians were being destroyed not for the public good, but to gratify the cruelty of an individual. Tacitus, I should say, notes this himself. Now, tradition says that both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome during this time of persecution under Nero. Later, in the 80s, the Roman Emperor Domitian continued to develop the practice of what we call emperor worship. I'll talk a little bit more about emperor worship, or I think actually we did in our previous lecture. But Domitian was the first emperor to have himself officially titled in Rome as God the Lord. He insisted that other people hail his greatness with honored titles such as Lord of the Earth, Invincible, Glory, Holy, and You Alone. You see, emperor worship essentially meant this, that at certain times and in certain regions of the empire, every person was expected to take an oath of loyalty and worship to the emperor and to the empire. And often this was how the oath worked. A person entered a room where there was a small statue of the emperor, and under the supervision of a government worker, they were expected to burn a pinch of incense before the statue and say, "Caesar is Lord." Then the government worker would give them a signed certificate, and that signed certificate would demonstrate that they had actually done this. Now, that document was called a libellus, and we have records of some of these libellus. We have, in particular, one that I want to show you from the Decian persecution about AD 250. And this reads, at least in part, "We have always been constant in sacrificing to the gods, and now too, in your presence, in accordance with the regulations, I have poured libations and sacrificed it and taste the offerings, and I ask you to certify for this below." You see, simply what this is, it's a certificate signed by different government officials and proving that a certain person had went through this ceremony of saying, "Caesar is Lord." Now, you can see the difficulty right away for a Christian, can you not? You see, even though the Romans saw this as primarily a political act, sort of what we call in the United States the Pledge of Allegiance, Christians rightly saw it as an act of worship because you had to go before a statue, burn a pinch of incense, which was understood to be a small act of worship. You're doing it before an image, before an idol, and you were supposed to say these words, "Caesar is Lord." And Christians would say, that's an idol. I'm not sacrificing anything to it. And only Jesus Christ is Lord. Christians, if they were faithful to their confession of faith, they would refuse to do this. And because they refused, many Christians were persecuted and martyred. Now, even under the difficult persecution of Domitian, God was still working. In the year 95, Domitian executed or exiled several members of his own family on charges of atheism, which Christians were often accused of because they rejected the normal Greek and Roman gods. So it's possible that even some of Domitian's own family came to faith in Jesus Christ. Now, with that little overview finished, let me sort of go through a list of some things that just kind of help you to understand persecution in the early church. One important thing to understand about persecution in the early church is that it was never constant or universal. Well, what am I trying to say about that? Well, if you take the 212 years from the year 100 to the year 312, and we're just choosing those as somewhat arbitrary periods. They make sense for their own reasons. But if you take that 212-year period, it's not as if Christians were always being persecuted across the entire Roman Empire for 212 years. It wasn't like that at all. Persecution was never constant or universal. It would come in some regions more than others. Now, there were certain persecutions that tended to be more universal in the Roman Empire, but generally speaking, persecutions were localized, often depending on the local government. This kind of brings up our second principle here. Persecution often depended on the local government official. They could kind of decide how they would persecute believers, if they would do it just economically, just socially, if they would do it by throwing them in prison, if they would do it by making them slaves, or would they actually put Christians to the death? So in many regions, it was really up to the local governor how they would carry out such persecution. A third thing I want you to understand about persecution in the early church is that there were many Christians who lapsed or failed under the threat of persecution. Friends, look, I would like to tell you that in this early church period, a time that we associate with very heroic Christians, I would like to tell you that every Christian was a hero, that everyone stood boldly for the faith, that everyone never betrayed a brother, that everyone never gave up the scriptures, that everyone never informed on others, that everyone never denied the faith. But that's just not true. Many Christians lapsed. They would compromise their faith by complying with the imperial directives or by cooperating with government authorities, and they did this under the threat of persecution. Now, during certain seasons of persecution, as the years went on, there were many Christians who lapsed, who compromised. This was true in the 250s AD. And they had to really deal with the whole idea of what do we do with the lapsed Christians? This whole idea was very divisive for the church. There were some believers who said, if a Christian has lapsed, if they compromised their faith, if they denied their faith during a time of persecution, they will never be allowed back in the church again, period. They're done. They're going to hell, and that's it. There were other Christians who just kind of said, hey, no big deal. Just say you're sorry and everything's good. A lot of the church, I can't tell you if it was a majority or not, but a lot of the church kind of decided on what I think was a wise middle position. They said this: if you repent of your compromise, if you repent of your denial of Jesus Christ, you can come back to the church. We will receive you as a believer, but you come back to the church as a beginner all over again. If you remember in our last lecture, we talked about how they would receive newcomers into the church with discipleship classes that would last maybe 3 years, maybe 6 years. They would say, you go back to the beginning. You start your discipleship class all over again. We will receive you back in our fold, but only if you come back as a true beginner. But the church had to deal with those who failed, who compromised, who lapsed under persecution. Here's another thing to think about. Number 4, the church allowed Christians to escape and flee, and sometimes Christians had to be told that it was okay. There were, in some places in the early church period, an unhealthy desire for martyrdom. There were some situations where Christians actually sought out martyrdom. And the general attitude of the church, again, I think wisely, was no. If you can flee honorably without denying Jesus Christ, without informing on your brothers and sisters, then that's fine. If just moving to another place can spare you persecution, then you should do it. So the church definitely allowed Christians to escape and to flee persecution, and they had to warn believers against rushing into voluntary martyrdom. Here's another principle to think about here in regard to persecution. The high regard for the martyrs eventually led to the veneration of the saints. Look, the early church rightly regarded their martyrs, especially the particularly brave and heroic martyrs. These were the top men and women of the church. These were true heroes of the faith. And they regarded them that way. And so often what they would do is they would get together every year on the anniversary of their death and remember the courage and the life and the sacrifice of that particular believer. Well, it kind of came into the place where you would venerate that particular saint on that particular day. Oftentimes it was connected, at least initially, with the day of their death. This was a very innocent beginning to something that I think developed later in a bad way, that is the veneration of the saints. Something else for you to consider, it's simply this. Number 6, the catacombs around Rome were burial places, and they were not normally used as gathering places for Christians. Look, there was nothing terribly secret about the catacombs. Their locations were known to the authorities. The catacombs, as burial places, had to be registered with the authorities. So the idea that sometimes we think that these underground places were places where Christians met in secret, well, if that happened, it didn't happen very often. For the most part, the catacombs were known, and they were places where people buried their dead, and they might have something of a memorial service honoring the dead down in the catacombs, but they really weren't normally places that were used for worship. Another thing, just to inform you about persecution in the early church, between the year 125 and 160 was a long period. What is that? Some 35 years. A long period with very little official persecution. This was a time when Christians enjoyed a measure of toleration. There were very few martyrdoms recorded in that era. It was sort of a high point in some ways for the Greco-Roman culture. And then here's number 8, a point here. It has been estimated that more Christians have been martyred since the year 1900 than in all the years before 1900. There's been a lot of estimations of this in years past. in recent years, I should say, where it used to be that people estimated that thousands upon thousands of Christians were martyred in the early church period. It may have numbered certainly in the thousands. It probably did, but it wasn't as vast numbers as many people thought. The martyrdom was more significant in its spiritual and psychological impact upon the church than it was in its raw numbers. Oftentimes, the Romans wanted to make their persecution as efficient as possible, so they would focus the persecution upon the leaders of the congregations. This would make other people hesitate to step up as leaders within the church, but it would also mean that the church was left without leadership, at least for a time. But it's probably true that more people were martyred, have been murdered, simply because they were Christians since the year 1900 than in all the church's history before 1900, including, of course, the early church period. A lot of this, honestly, has to do with the effect of violent communism in the 20th century. A couple more points to make about the nature of persecution here in the early church. Number 9, often persecution was not to the death, but it was economic, social, and educational, or to torture, imprison, or to put people in work camps. I guess what I'm trying to say this is many of those who were persecuted were not martyred. If the only thing we think of as persecution is martyrdom, then we ignore the many other ways that Christians suffered in the early church period, and of course, many ways that Christians can suffer today in the modern world. There was an early church leader named Cyprian, and he wrote a letter to banished Christians, sort of as an attempt to encourage believers who were sent to work in the Roman mines near Segua. So I'm just going to read you a couple paragraphs from Cyprian's letter to these believers who, for their faith, were sent away as prisoners, slaves, to work in the Roman mines. This is what Cyprian says. Cyprian 2, the brethren in the mines, martyrs of God the Father Almighty, and of Jesus Christ our Lord, and of God our preserver, everlasting greeting. As golden and silver vessels, you have been committed to the mine that is the home of gold and silver, except that now the nature of the mines is changed, and the places which previously had been accustomed to yield gold and silver have begun to receive them. I like that opening to the letter. He's saying, look, you guys are familiar with gold and silver. You're in mines right now. But these mines are receiving gold and silver. You are the gold and silver in the mines. Now, continuing another portion of this letter, Cyprian wrote, moreover, they have put fetters, those are like chains, shackles, on our feet, and have bound your blessed limbs and the temples of God with disgraceful chains. To men who are dedicated to God and attesting their faith with religious courage, such things are ornaments, not chains, nor do they bind the feet of Christians for infamy, but glorify them for a crown. In other words, just like the Apostle Paul much said, they're putting chains on you, but it's like jewelry. It's like decoration for you. He continues on, let cruelty, either ignorant or malignant, hold you here in its bonds and chains as long as it will. From this earth and from these sufferings you shall speedily come to the kingdom of heaven. The body is not cherished in the mines with couch and cushioned, but it is cherished with the refreshments and solace of Christ. Your limbs unbathed are foul and disfigured with filth and dirt, but within they are spiritually cleansed. There the bread is scarce, but man lives not by bread alone, but by the word of God. Shivering, you lack clothing, but he who puts on Christ is abundantly clothed and borne. This temporal and brief suffering, how shall it be exchanged for the reward of a bright and eternal honor, when, according to the word of the blessed apostle, the Lord shall change the body of our humiliation, that it may be fashioned like to the body of his brightness. Farewell in the Lord, and always and everywhere remember me. I can't read something like that written by early Christians and think of these 9 brethren that Cyprian knew very well, who were arrested for being Christians, sentenced to live as slaves, maybe live until they worked themselves to death in these Roman mines near Segura, and think what a glorious testimony they had. What a God-honoring thing it will be to meet those dear brothers and perhaps sisters in heaven. All right, let me talk about one more aspect here, these 10 just kind of ideas or points. Another reason, number 10, the scriptures were often destroyed in persecutions. You see, often persecution was focused on church leaders and on destroying the scriptures. In 303, the Roman Emperor Diocletian demanded that every copy of the scriptures in the Roman Empire be burned. I want you to think about this. How many copies there are of the scriptures and why we wish we had so many earlier copies of the scriptures. Well, it's simply because there was a very dedicated effort to burn those. And we're certainly grateful that they did not completely succeed, but we can imagine how many hundreds or thousands ancient scrolls were burned in persecutions. Now, I want to go on to another section of this lecture and simply deal with the whole issue of why is it that Christians were persecuted? I mean, did the Romans just wake up one day and say, hey, let's persecute the Christians? No, of course, it was not like that. The Romans believed they had good reasons to persecute Christians. Friends, this is how it always is throughout history. Nobody comes along and says, I'm an evil person and I want to act evil today, so I'm going to persecute a bunch of Christians. Nobody does that, of course not. In the minds of the persecutors, they believe that they have reasons. But of course, those reasons are never valid before God. So let's take a look at some of the reasons why the Romans considered or claimed were valid reasons for them to persecute Christians. First of all, Christians were seen as strange and antisocial. They were considered to be haters of humanity because they didn't participate in the idolatry, the cruelty, and the debauchery that was just part of normal life in the Roman Empire. Look, in many cities in the Roman Empire, the gladiatorial games were a big deal. And these were unbelievably brutal. There's nothing like this in entertainment today, where people would actually, in the most horrific way possible, literally murder one another before a cheering audience. You know, today we think of the sports of boxing or wrestling, and we think that these are intense enough. But these are people actually killing and torturing and dismembering one another publicly. Well, Christians wouldn't take any part in that. Christians said, no, I'm not going to go and watch the gladiatorial games. I'm not going to watch one man murder another man for my entertainment. And for things like that, Christians were called haters of humanity. They were considered to be antisocial. What? Well, why are you antisocial? Why don't you want to go to the gladiatorial games with me? And the Christians say, no, that's not for me. Now, again, I want to stress, the charge of being antisocial, the charge of being a hater of humanity was completely false. It was a lie. But it was something that Christians were accused of, and it was used as a justification to murder, imprison, rob, and just torture Christians. That's number one. Number two, Christians were feared as a threat to the Roman Empire because they held that Jesus was their God instead of Rome and its emperors. This is a very important point, is it not? Christians were absolutely insistent that Jesus Christ is the Lord of Lords. He is the King of Kings. And Jesus Christ is higher than any Roman governor, higher than any Roman senator, higher than any Roman emperor. He is the Lord of Lords. And because of this, they were seen as dangerous, a threat to the Roman Empire. Number 3, Christians were condemned as atheists because they didn't recognize the gods of Rome or other nations. They only recognized Jesus. Isn't that interesting? It sounds very strange to us that people would accuse Christians of being atheists, but that's what they did in the Roman world. In the Roman world, they said, well, you only worship one God, you're practically an atheist. You deny the validity of our pagan gods, our Persian gods, our Greek gods, our Roman gods. You deny their validity. You are a practical atheist because you only worship Jesus. But that's all the Christians would do, of course. They would not recognize any other God, but worship Jesus and Jesus alone. That's number 3. Number 4, Christians were often lied against. People in the early church culture said that Christians were cannibals. They said that Christians were immoral. They said that Christians were revolutionaries against the social order. Now, again, why? Why would people tell such lies against Christians? Why would they do such things? Well, again, they would call Christians cannibals because they would say, well, they get together in these secret ceremonies where they eat the body and drink the blood of their founder. And people say, well, that's cannibalism. And Christians often did not want to open up the Lord's Supper, their celebration of communion, or the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it exactly. They did not like to open up that celebration to the community. They kept it as something for believers only. And so outsiders would look at secret ceremony. They're eating the body and drinking the blood of their founder. This is cannibalism. They would also, Christians would be described as being immoral. I mean, sexually immoral. Why? Well, because their meetings were described as agape feasts, love feasts, and they spoke a lot about loving everyone. And in that culture where everything was hyper-sexualized, they said, well, their love feasts, their claims to love everyone, there must be some very immoral sexual conduct happening among Christians. It was a lie, but this is what they said. And thirdly, it was said that Christians were revolutionaries against the social order. Why? Because everyone was welcome among them, including slaves and the despised ones of society. This was a scandal to much of Roman society of that day, that you would go to a church and there would be a slave and a master sitting side by side worshiping God together in church. And in some cases, the slave might be the pastor of the church and the master might be under his pastoral authority. The Romans looked at that and said, this is anarchy. This is disorder. The Christians looked at it and said, this is glorious because we are a kingdom of a different kind. We don't respect your hierarchies of the world. We respect the order that God has given to the church. So for the Romans, this was sometimes upsetting to them. But for the Christians, it was glorious. Now, I want to go on and talk about something called the investigation of Pliny. Pliny was a Roman government sent by the Emperor Trajan to reorganize the affairs of the province of Bithynia in the year 112. He had questions about how to conduct the persecution of Christians. So he wrote the Emperor Trajan. This is fascinating, at least it's fascinating to me, how here you have a Roman Roman official named Pliny, and he's asking for advice regarding persecution. By the way, Pliny thought that Christianity was just insanity. And this is what he said. He said that the insanity of Christianity has infected many of all ages and ranks. He said, listen, in our area, the temples are almost deserted, and it's even hard to sell food for the sacrificial animals because there's so few of them. And this was very surprising to Pliny. And he tried to bring the Christians under control by arresting them and then by executing some of them who would refuse to burn a pinch of incense to Caesar. So this is the letter from Pliny to Trajan. This is what he says. This is the course that I have adopted. I ask them if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time, threatening capital punishment. If they persist, I sentence them to death, for their inflexible obstinacy should certainly be punished. Christians who are Roman citizens I reserve to be sent to Rome. I discharge those who were willing to curse Christ, a thing which it is said a genuine Christian cannot be persuaded to do. Well, I think that this was a very interesting and in some ways a very clever letter to write. And so this is what Pliny asked Trajan about doing this exact thing. Now, you might be wondering, well, what did they do? What was the response of the emperor? In his response, Trajan told Pliny not to seek out Christians for arrest, but when they were exposed, when they were informed against, then deal with them as he had described. Yes, go ahead and try to force them to deny Christ. If they will not deny Christ, then you are to execute them. Interesting exchange there. Let me continue on here by giving you stories of a few people who were persecuted in this early church period. Just a quick examination of a few individuals. The first one I want to tell you about is a man named Ignatius. When Ignatius was an old man, the Roman Emperor Trajan made a visit to Antioch and was told that the bishop of the despised and hated group known as the Christians wanted to see him. So, according to some accounts, I know some of this is disputed, but I'll give it to you as it is in some accounts. Trajan spoke to Ignatius bitterly. Trajan said, "There you are, you wicked devil, deceiver of men." And Ignatius said, "I'm not an evil spirit, but I have Jesus Christ in my heart." Trajan said, "Jesus Christ within you? Do you mean him who was crucified by Pontius Pilate?" And Ignatius said, "Yes, he was crucified for my sins." After this, the emperor, without any further legal proceedings, condemned him to be taken to Rome and thrown to the wild animals before some cheering Roman crowds. That was the death of Ignatius. Justin Martyr, well, he was a powerful defender of the faith who died about 165. He wrote several important books that have survived. He tried to show that the Christian faith alone was truly rational. And so he taught that the Logos, or the Word, became incarnate to teach humanity truth and to redeem people from the power of demons. Justin Martyr said, "You can kill us, but you can't hurt us." Justin and some of his disciples were denounced as Christians sometime in the year 165. They were taken before the prefect of Rome. The prefect asked them if they were Christians and if they would sacrifice to the gods. And Justin replied this. He said, "No one who is rightly minded would turn from the true to the false." And when the prefect threatened them with death, Justin said this, "If we are to be punished for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ, we hope to be saved." Then they were taken out and beheaded. Here's a man named Polycarp. It was around the year 156, or perhaps later, maybe about the year 166. An urban mob demanded the arrest of Polycarp. He was the bishop of Smyrna, during what the ecclesiastical historian Eusebius termed the great persecution that disturbed the province of Asia. Again, you're talking about probably between 166 and 169. Other Christians had been arrested, tried, and executed before Polycarp was arrested. One of them had rushed towards martyrdom, but only later denied his faith when he saw the beasts, perhaps lions, in the amphitheater. Polycarp was brought before the proconsul, who begged him to have respect for his great age. Polycarp was probably near 100 years old. And he told him, listen, Polycarp, please swear by the genius of Caesar. Denounce the atheists. But Polycarp, when he saw the lawless heathen in the theater, he waved his hands at them and he looked up to heaven with a groan and said, away with these atheists. The proconsul, who was not looking forward to executing this old man, he said, swear and I will release you. Curse Christ. And this is what Polycarp answered. He said, 86 years I have served him, and he's done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? He was condemned to death and then burned alive. Another martyr, a little bit later, this is in Lyon in the year 177. Lyon was one of the most important cities in the Roman province of Gaul, and there was a terrible persecution there in the year 177, there and in the nearby city of Vienna. The persecutors needed evidence against the Christians, so they arrested and tortured the servants of some suspected Christians. Under torture, the Christians said that their Christian masters were guilty of two crimes. They said that the Christians were guilty of cannibalism and they were guilty of immorality. And these accusations fired up a mob, and a total of 48 Christians died either in prison or in the arena. And one of them was a Christian slave girl named Blandina. She was an example of the great suffering that the believers in Lyon endured. An ancient letter described her heroism. It said this: Blandina was filled with such power that those who by turns kept torturing her in every way from dawn until evening were worn out and exhausted, and themselves confessed defeat from lack of anything else to do to her. They marveled that breath still remained in a body all mangled and covered with large wounds, and they testified that a single form of torture was sufficient to render life extinct, let alone such and so many. But eventually Blandina was led to a cross in the arena. Wild animals were set upon her. Now, other people who were being tortured in the arena drew courage when they saw Blandina pray. None of the animals would touch her. So she was cut down from the cross and sent back to prison. Yet later she was brought back to the arena, whipped publicly, put on a hot iron grill, and killed by a bull. And then another one to share with you, the 40 martyrs of Sebaste. About the year 320, 40 Christian soldiers from the Roman army were left naked to die on a frozen lake. The Romans were afraid that Christians would take their peaceful and even pacifistic ways and destroy the army's will to fight. Because many Christians refused to fight, often Christians were not tolerated in the Roman army in times of war. In the year 320, near the end of the Great Persecution, the Emperor Licinius ordered all the Christians to renounce their faith on pain of death. There were 40 soldiers of the 12th Legion stationed at Sebaste in Armenia. They refused. So they were stripped naked, forced out onto a frozen lake, and left to die from exposure. On the banks of that lake, they built fires to attract them, to say, hey, come over. Here are some warm baths. They were prepared for anybody who would deny Jesus, and only one of the 40 gave in. Yet when he did, another soldier, so moved by the example of the suffering Christians, declared himself a Christian and took the apostate's place. Within 24 hours, most of the 40 were dead. The others were then put to death. And then one more. I thought I would deal something on the continent of Africa. The persecution of the Coptic Christians of Egypt in the early 4th century. Eusebius of Caesarea saw and described some of the terrible persecution suffered by Egyptian Christians during the last days of the early church period, around 311 or so. Eusebius wrote this, that some suffered beheading, others punishment by fire, so that the murderous axe was dulled and worn out and was broken in places, while the executioners themselves grew utterly weary. They were tired from executing so many people. But every time this happened, Eusebius claimed that volunteers for martyrdom came forward. He said, quote, as soon as sentence was passed on one, another from another quarter and others from another would leap up to the tribunal and confess themselves Christians. Eusebius said that these Christians often went to their deaths singing psalms and hymns. During this early church period, many Christians became evangelists to the death. But really, it was only later in this early church period that martyrdom became a serious factor in the church's growth. When the Roman Empire was flourishing and the values of Roman civilization were valued, among others, then Christians were seen as an illegal and maybe even disloyal minority. But martyrs displayed their zeal to a hostile or sometimes indifferent populace until the end part of the early church period. That's when it really seemed to have an effect. Here's an example. There was a persecution in the year 303 through 312, perhaps the great persecution suffered in this early church period. It affected almost everywhere in the Roman Empire, in the cities and in the countryside, and it was carried out to the letter by Roman officials. But many pagans, seeing the great violence of these persecutions, began to have doubt about their effectiveness and their worth. Well, first of all, there were just too many Christians to kill. But by this time, many Christians had served in the army. They had served in the government. In addition, Christians didn't forsake Christianity in large groups during this persecution. And the courage of these persecuted Christians really had an influence on public opinion. There was a North African teacher of speech, of rhetoric, named Lactantius. He immigrated to Asia Minor, that's modern-day Turkey, and he found employment at Diocletian's court. He became a Christian, and he wrote of events at Nicomedia and in the surrounding province of Bithynia. Christianity was growing rapidly, Lactantius said, and God permitted the persecution of some Christians in order to draw in more believers. This is what he wrote, quote, great numbers are driven from the worship of false gods by the hatred of cruelty. The people who stand around hear them saying in the midst of these very torments that they do not sacrifice to stones wrought by the hand of man, but to the living God who's in heaven. Many understand that this is true, and they admit it in their hearts. You see, pagans were amazed to see Christians who would rather die than worship the Roman gods, who would rather die than forsake their faith to Jesus Christ. It made the pagans wonder if their gods were worth dying for. And of course, they weren't. Lactantius said that there were many reasons that a great multitude came to faith in Jesus. He said that there were miracles and exorcisms were some of the reasons, but one of the biggest reasons was the courage of Christians as they faced persecution. All right, let me finish up with this. A very famous example of an opponent of Christianity was the Roman Emperor Diocletian. He was such a determined enemy of Christianity that he persecuted the church without mercy. And he liked to think that he had defeated Christianity. He even struck a medallion, made a coin, a medallion that said this: "The name of Christianity being extinguished." Now, that medallion you see on the screen, that isn't the same medallion. That's another medallion of Diocletian. But just to give you an idea of a medallion with Diocletian's image and saying, this is the man who extinguished, who wiped out the name of Christianity. And Diocletian also set up some monuments on the frontier of his empire. They found 2 of these monuments with these inscriptions. Here you go. Diocletian, Jovian, Maximin, Herculeus, Caesarius Augusti, for having extended the Roman Empire in the east and the west, and for having extinguished the name of Christians who brought the republic to ruin. That's one inscription. Here's the second one. Diocletian, Jovian, Maximin, Herculeus, Caesarius Augusti, for having everywhere abolished the superstition of Christ, for having extended the worship of the gods. I find it fascinating that Diocletian, towards the very end of the early church period, boasted of having wiped out Christianity. Brother, sister, Diocletian is dead and gone. He's a footnote on the pages of history. But the fame of Jesus Christ is spread over all the earth, and the gates of hell have still never prevailed against the church of Jesus Christ. It is like an anvil that a blacksmith uses that is worn out hammer after hammer after hammer. We praise God for the amazing promise of Jesus, and that despite all the persecution that has been brought against the Christian faith, both in the early church period and afterwards, Jesus Christ is still triumphant, and his church is still glorious over all the earth. I hope that's an encouragement to you. And I hope that you think about these and are given courage by these things until our next lecture together. God bless you.